All right, so welcome to Suppress History's Ancient Britain, and we're going to slosh over those boundaries a little bit at the end, just to show some of the continuities. But, this used to be part of a show that was about all the Celtic cultures, and as more and more information comes in, of course, the Megalithic era is pre-Celtic, we get a pretty broad spectrum just on this one island. And so I'm going to start out in the Orkney Islands because amazingly in the Neolithic, the ancient megalithic cultures spread all the way up to these islands to the north side of Scotland, way out there in the North Sea. And this was found in one of those islands. The name Aldwifey in Scots does not necessarily, a wife, the word wif, Anglo-Saxon word, meant woman originally. Wifman is where woman comes from. And there was Verman, which was the male person and the female person was the meaning of those names. But anyway, so, because I react against that name myself. But anyway, female icon, very abstract icon found. You can see how old that is, over 5,000 years old. And here is one of the amazing megalithic structures in the Orkneys. Maes How. How means a mound, literally, a hilltop or a mound. Some of the passage graves are given that name, but this is not a burial. This one is a ceremonial structure, maybe also a village gathering ground with no cremations or anything like that. So like a temple. And there's a lot of these structures from very old periods. You see the dates there. This is very windy country. They're right there on the sea. The cold winds are blowing all the time. And so you've got these semi-subterranean, both the dwellings and also some of the passage graves there. And Skara Brae, which was discovered by a storm that tore off the covering of it basically, was really originally embedded in a midden. See, they've excavated all of this out. It was filled with soil, and that some of that was refuse from the houses, and they did this in order to break the wind. Anyway, you can see how it has like a turf roof on it. It was right there facing the sea. And this is an excavated, one of the houses where the entrance is over here. And so there's what they call this dresser facing. People could put stuff in there. Also beds and a central hearth. And so these are big collective dwellings, acclimated to the climate. And here in the center of the Orkney Islands, you've got some of the things you may have heard of. I don't have all these slides in here, but the Ring of Brodgar is a famous standing stone circle, and Stones of Stennis, and there's another ring up here. And so many important monuments, the Ness of Brodgar, this standing stone here, and a little shot there on the bottom of the ring. I haven't scanned the show, the Ancient Britain show, in the slides I have, so there are pieces not yet here, just whatever I happen to have digitally. But I want to back up from that Neolithic period for a moment. I mean, it is probably still the Neolithic, but there were, as well as the architectural structures, the engineering projects with these gigantic standing stones and colossal passageways and so forth. First, you have humans that are engraving petroglyphs onto the rock, on the landscape. And so here from the Moors, and there's a lot of the same kinds of symbolism. This right here is referred to as a cup and ring mark in archaeology. And you can see, we're going to see numerous examples of this, how what looks circular here through the course of people scraping out rock dust from these begins to take on more and more of a volvular shape, And so not only that, but from it, there streams a channel. And we'll see these channels which were used, probably pouring libation into the central opening, and then it pours off through these channels. And you can see how that works really well on this image, because the channels are deliberately made so that the liquid pours down the rock. But you also have some vulva shapes here. They're very definitely not circular, some of them. And here's another example from let's see, I'm covering up my own view here with Chatton Hill. Various parts, not just in Scotland, but all over Britain and in Ireland. Ketley Crag. And so these rock shelters are places that are Paleolithic sites, they're Mesolithic, and then on into the Neolithic when people are beginning to farm and so forth. But you know, in early days, they were also places people actually literally camped. So there's long, long continuities of use happening here. But here you can see very clearly, very strong vulva symbolism in the way that these are detailed out, and then the channels coming out from them. And here's an aerial view, kind of some kind of techno-digital view showing some patterns that have been worn down almost to unrecognizability. But you can see this one especially very strong vulva symbolism. And so there are lots of these stones all over Britain. This one's interesting because it seems to encompass various different periods. These are very archaic, clearly, and this one you could even say that conceptually represents a fertilization of an egg. There's a lot of ways of looking at these. Some of the other symbols like this one may date from a later period. We're going to see this exact sign in the Pictish stones in Scotland at a much later period. And as you can see on the land, these little hollows also fill up with rainwater. You know, but there's a lot of different examples of these. I think this is Auchnabrec, I can't recall. So lots of these all over and the other thing that's significant, and I know I say this in every show, but it is true, that these places remain on the landscape. So whatever else happens with kings and Christianity and churches, all of that, wars, everybody growing up in this area, the kids are playing here, people are walking by it, stories accumulate about these places, and so they remain part of folk memory. They're part of the cultural record. That is something people are conscious of, especially in these pre-mass media days. So this is fairly early also, very much still in the Neolithic period. And there are a number of these stone balls. This is by far the most dramatic one, very carefully detailed with spirals and other patterns, eye patterns. The double spiral here that begins at the central point and it goes out in one direction. And it also goes out in the other direction. And so these coils, it's almost as if you took a double helix and what it would look like if you flattened it. And so what are these? This has been the big question. There's a theory that these may have been used as fishing weights because these indentations are made as if it was to make it possible to tie something around these. But nobody has really proved consistently. Iris asks, how are these carved into this stone? I'm not really sure, but they were using stone tools. This is pre-Bronze Age. It could be bone. Sometimes you find bone tools also being used in the Neolithic. And so here's one of the many stone circles. And I actually took this picture that's in the northwest of England, right there at the borderlands of Scotland. And you can see back in the background, this is Long Meg, the tallest of the stones, who's at a distance, and then there's a circle of what they're calling her daughters. And on Long Meg herself, you have those same concentric patterns. So there's a transitional period between the older Neolithic carvings of rocks on the landscape and then the use of boulders to create passage graves and stone circles and standing stones. And so there's quite a few of these circles, and they have folk names very often referring to the 9 maidens, or the Dancing Maidens, or the 9 sisters. And here again from Dartmoor, out there on the moors. And so there are all kinds of legends about these stones and how at the Midsummer Eve, they dance their way down to the water and immerse themselves in the water. Lots of seasonal observances connected in folk memory with them. This one, the 9 maidens from formerly Celtic region, Cornwall, Cairnragh. And here's another one from Cairnragh. So it's called the Merry Maidens. And this one has the standing stone in the center rather than as a sight line off in the distance. And there's quite a bit of evidence that these had astronomical and calendrical significance to them. And then there's Avebury. And a lot of people talk about Stonehenge, and gosh, do I even have a picture of Stonehenge in here? But Avebury, a lot of the British scholars that I've known, Monica Shue and Cheryl Straffen and others, are convinced that Avebury was older and it was more central. And look at some of the stones they picked. Look at how this really reflects a woman's body very clearly. And they picked out these stones with these interesting formations to them. But here's the aerial view of Avebury. And you can see that the size of it is such that an entire village is inside of it. So they dug this huge bank out. It has a ditch surrounded by a high berm all the way around. This is ceremonial enclosure, and I think they've kept pretty well the quadrant shape internally of it. And then inside of it, you can see one smaller circle of standing stones and then another larger one around the ends. And some of these stones have been removed. I don't think this is intact. And they've also found wood henge and pathways between Avebury and these other stone henges that showed ceremonial causeways that existed in ancient times. So Montesquieu claimed that Avebury was a much more matriarchal formation. It is older than Stonehenge, and that Stonehenge represents the rise of a Bronze Age priesthood. Putting that very simply, but that's basically the gist of what she's saying about that. So those are the well-known examples, but there are a lot of other what the archaeologists call passage graves. And here's an example, the West Kennet Long Barrow. So here's the entrance, and you go in through this channel. Originally, this would have been covered by earth. You can see the side stones. Here's a external view. And then there is these crossbars of giant stones placed over the top that the earth was then piled over. And this is the passageway that you're going through. And again, very unusual shapes. This one looks like a water eroded piece of stone, which were chosen, I'm sure, for their beauty and perhaps other significance to these hollows, these natural hollows in the stone. And some architectural features on there also. So West Kennet Anglesey Island or Mona Island off the coast of Wales. You have Bryn Celyn, and this is what the passage graves are, what we like to call the womb tombs in feminism. It's symbolically the womb of Mother Earth, and so the dead are collectively laid to rest inside this mound, which is like the body of a woman. You enter through this vulval opening into a vaginal passageway, and then finally a uterine chamber on the inside. And so this is the walls in Bryn Celyn, and showing that it looks like we're looking from the inside toward the out. I'm not really sure about that. And also a standing stone that was placed outside of it. And so you have patterns here, kind of snaky looking patterns that recall a lot of Paleolithic art, a lot of Neolithic art, and even some of the petroglyphs that are shown in the Irish passage graves. You have spiral markings, very similar to what you see on the curbstones at Brunaboyne and Douth and Knowth. Here's another view of the, this is a different one actually, Barclodiad Igauris. You can see it right near the water side there, but basically a mound of the Earth Mother who regenerates the dead. And so the patterns on these are very congruent with what we see in Ireland in this same period. And just as in Celtic times, there was a lot of interchange going back and forth between these islands. But the spirals, the zigzags, the chevrons, and other patterns that you'll see at Knowth and Fornox and other places like that in Ireland. And yet it seems as if they were continuing to also make petroglyphs on stone that would have originally been on the landscape. This may have later on been placed this way in front of this wall here in Yorkshire. Here's another one from Yorkshire. And so these very archaic patterns keep recurring on these. They're not necessarily parts of structures. Sometimes it's just the freestanding stone out there on the land. And this one rather aptly called Honeypot's Farm, because you have these very clear vulva symbols that are very deliberately not made as circles. They are a vulva, they're kind of gathered together at the ends and open very often also at the ends. And this also tracks with what see on the vaginal walls, for example, at Cairntee in Loughcrew, Ireland, in Westmeath. So that I was astonished. I took this picture. The entire walls, as you go into this chamber, are studded with these deeply grooved vulvas. And so that you can get a glimpse of ceremonial acts that were not only done to consecrate the space, but were also part of people's ceremonial practice in an ongoing way over the 2,000 years that these were in use. And so carving out rock dust and deepening the patterns by doing so, and who knows what they were doing with this rock powder. Some could be used in conception magic or funeral ceremonies. We don't know. Ceremonies of regeneration. So coming over to the Bronze Age, these are the Folkton drums. They're not even really sure they're drums, but it's not clear what else they might be. They are limestone pieces. This is much enlarged. They're not really that huge, with the what I call the ancestor face. Here, the brow ridge, the nose, and the eyes. And this one has a mouth with sort of maybe tattoo patterns coming off the side that a lot of the ancestor faces in megalithic Europe don't necessarily show the mouth. They just show the eyes and the brow. But here's other views of them. It looks like maybe a moth here engraved. There's 3 of these found in a child's grave. And so this is really getting out of the Neolithic and going into the Bronze Age. Oh, here's another rollout showing what the patterns are that were engraved on the sides of these limestone carvings. How tall are these stones? I'm not sure what that question was in relation to. Are you talking about the standing stones? And if so, I don't really necessarily know for each one. You know, a lot of this is gathered ad hoc, and information is not always forthcoming. I mean, I really sat there and looked up the site. I could probably find out the sizes for them. But then also there's a pattern in the Bronze Age of the lunulae, meaning the crescent moon-shaped pectorals or necklaces that were worn, and primarily in Ireland. You can see the great bulk of them are found there. But there's also examples from Scotland. There are 11 that were found in Britain, and a few in the corner of northwestern continent of Europe. Very characteristic, these patterns just at the edges and along the borders of the lunulae. And so these are very tempting to think that they may have had a priestessly aspect to them. It could be adornments that were owned by the elite. There is a class stratification that is evident in the Bronze Age. Here's a really good example of what the patterns look like, and they vary, you know, stylistically from place to place, but this is clearly something that spread through all these countries. You know, there was very influential, and we can kind of visualize what this looked like on the body, someone wearing these. This one's crinkled from having been, a lot of them were found in bogs, swamps and bogs, and they probably were not just lost there, oh, I'm walking through the bog and my necklace fell off, but really actually deliberately tossed in there as offerings. And we know the Gauls did this on a regular basis, so there's written reference to this in Roman accounts. Here's an example from Germany, and also you have a little correspondence to that in the moaned horns, which I'm not going to show, but they have a lot of lunar crescent type of symbolism in the Bronze Age in Germany. Here's a really beautiful example from Wales. So you can see some places have the zigzags and others have these very delicate patterns on them. Another piece of Bronze Age bling, and this is gold from Clwyd or mold in Wales, and I don't know the proportions of this, whether we can decide that this was worn by a man or a woman, or we're going to just have to leave it ungendered. But you can see like the appearance of gold in a big way, and it may have been present earlier because there was looting of the megalithic passage graves. The Vikings looted Brunabonia and other sites looking for treasure. Who knows if they found it or not. But one of the things that comes up, and these are bronze, but they're not from the Bronze Age, are the mirrors. bronze and sometimes combined with steel, which we can see here in the handle. And the patterns here are characteristically part of a late Celtic cultural pattern that's known as the Latin horizon. And so its signature is these beautiful swirling shapes. It's as if they're depicting the movement of power through nature, through the universe. And a lot of these are made with hatch marks. There's different styles to them, but you'll see very similar patterns on the Tara brooch in Ireland and other places. And these are very strongly associated with female burials. I mean, there's definitely a female signature to these that has gone through some reinterpretation, because the older accounts were like, well, yes, women like to be pretty, and these are aristocratic women's, part of their beauty routine. And it's since been recognized that these are female prestige items, made at great expense and with great skill, as we can see in this gilt bronze example. Carrying through this old style that begins somewhere in the 4th century BCE, the Latin style. And these mirrors continue to be made into the 1st century, which is like, this is toward the end of that process. And so a lot of them, most of them, have been found in Britain, and with a few examples over across the Channel in the Netherlands and Germany. So I'm going to be coming back to the mirrors because that symbolism recurs in a big, big way, maybe 1,000 years later than what we just looked at. But I want to look a little bit also at the style of houses that were in the Bronze Age, or really the Iron Age. And these are reconstructions from the foundations of houses in the Iron Age, this time from Wales, and you've got your very typical thatching going on there. And really looking at these, if you didn't know this was from Wales, it could as easily be a picture from Uganda, other parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, a lot of places that have these kinds of things. Look how they kind of have the lip of the thatch moved up to allow the person to go in. But they're low entrances, and so there's also a defensive aspect to this, although they're not surrounded by palisades and other kinds of really militarized formations. But you kind of have to bend down to get inside, and that has a defensive aspect to it. And then there are the brochen. The brochs are these circular towers that you find in Scotland and also at an earlier period in Sardinia, where they're really more of Bronze Age vintage. But people were living in these circular towers as refuges, places of security in a period. The Iron Age is really like a warlike period. Someone asked, what Roman accounts describe Gauls leaving goods in bogs? There are missionaries, early Christian missionaries, that talk about this, and so we're talking about the very early Middle Ages, but there are also a lot of archaeological finds of things, of treasures that were deliberately left as offerings in lakes or bogs. Okay, so here's another picture of, oops, what did I just do here? All right, hold on a second. My chat window just got really big. All right, here we go. Yeah, so here's another view of a broch. It gives a little more of a close-up of what it looked like on the inside. And some of them have this interesting double construction. So they're very, very sturdy, ready to stand up against sieges. And so that shows you what survival was like in those periods. And then there's the carving in the chalk downs of England. And so this is an area where there's white chalk and then turf builds up over that, which people then cut away to make patterns. And the most famous of these are two giant male figures. But this is a lesser known one that I copied this from T.C. Lethbridge's book. He was a British antiquary writing about 100 some years ago. And so what they're showing here is the face of a woman, multi-breasted woman, hands to the breasts, and the uterus outlined. And then she's standing in front of what is, Lethbridge at least interprets as a mare, and that's probably the best bet rather than cattle You've got the udder here, and also a uterus. So there's this connection of women's life-giving powers of birth with the mare, which is seen in Celtic culture, the cult of the veneration of Epona, for example, but also in Central and Northern Asia. That connection comes up. And then we begin also out of the bogs to find remnants of wooden sculptures which only survived because they were pickled in the brine. The tannic solution of the bog kept them going. And so these are reconstructions of a very Sheila-like figure, an ancestral icon or a goddess. This is what she actually looks like at Balachulish, because the wood has warped from its time stewing in the bog. But it's not the only one of these types of figures, and you will see both male and female examples. Ones like this are kind of confusing. Is this supposed to be a female figure, or is this an opening in which a phallic member was inserted for some ceremonial purpose? So you find both male and female forms of those. And you also find stone sculptures like this, and these hardly ever appear in any of the studies, you know, when you're trying to find ancient British archaeology. I consider it very rare to see this being published, and I found it online. With the chalice placed in the position of the womb. This is a symbolism you'll also see on the Eurasian steppe. So there's quite a few carvings, and this is going over to France, but we can see that these are not done in Roman style. This is a native style, a Celtic style of carving, very strongly emphasized vulvic triangle on that one, also with this one here. And yet the Roman influence, as we're going to see, continues to increase, and they're actually causing a lot more stone carving to happen in styles that are coming out of the Mediterranean. So these little niches, for example, are due to Roman influence. But the type, the way that the carving is done, the way that the human figure is rendered with these kind of abbreviated limbs, and especially the woman here with her hand to the vulva, are much more native. You know, this is much more part of a Celtic cultural theme that's not found among the Romans. And so you've got already the threefold goddess. I mean, we're not really clear what this one is over here, but I think of these as proto-Sheilas because of the nakedness and the gesture to the vulva. And here also at Caerwent in Wales, you have a vulva-like opening. I mean, technically, this is supposed to be a seated woman, and this with her lap is kind of just flattened out because of the shape of the stone, but you're looking at her knees and her lower legs, and yet this whole formation, let me show it to you another way, the whole impression of the lower body actually looks like a giant vulva, you know, with this deep opening going into this. And so she holds in her hand a fruit possibly, or a globe, and then a branch or a frond. Her face is very mask-like. It's done in a really classically Celtic style, very simple. Again, the face is kind of flat. The nose isn't really carved out much. She was found buried 11 or 13 feet in the precincts of this temple. In Roman times, Venta Silurum it means the marketplace of the Silurs. And so you can see a Roman style settlement that grew up here due to the trade passing through this area. And so this temple exists in that context. This is at the limits of Roman power. And at some point, the burial of this goddess, she may have actually stood originally in the temple, but someone decides perhaps that it's a better idea to bury her really deep underground, maybe so the Christians don't get her, because we'll talk about that repression in a moment. But here's a rare picture that shows the sculpture, and notice how different she looks in different lighting and angles, the almost concave nature of the face. She has a veil and a heavy headdress behind her that you can see in these side views that doesn't really show up much in the frontal views. And stylistically, she looks very similar to Notre Dame de la Vie, who is in Savoie in France. Very similar way of rendering the face with the heavy jaw that we also see here. These are two views of the same statue of the 10 period in France who continued in a Christianized form to preside over a sacred water fountain. And we can also see the same stylistic comparison. The way the mouth and nose are carved and the eyes, the flatness of the face, and even the drape of a veil around the head to La Grand-Mère du Saint-Pierre on the island of Guernsey between France and England. And so what happened here is that this is a Celtic carving over a much older megalithic statue who looked originally probably something more like this. This is also in Guernsey. She was mutilated. Somebody went after one of her breasts, but you can see that the head is very abstract. It's just necklace and breast, which is the classic form for a lot of Northwestern and Southern European megalithic statues, ancestors statues, I would call them. But what happens is the Celtic population comes along and they carve this out later. We don't know what this looked like before. The breasts would have been there already, but you've got this same kind of face. They've elaborated on her. So there's this mixture of cultural forces going on, the ancestral elder kindreds that gave rise to these original female statue menhirs on Guernsey Island, and then later a Celtic population that kind of edits them. Anyhow, that's all just a look back at the continuities that we see going on between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and even the Iron Age. But now I'm going to be showing some examples of art that was done in Britain during Roman times, after the Roman conquest. And so this is a little piece of lead, which I really love it. I don't even think it's very big, but you've got the face of a long-haired woman with horns. And she's wearing some kind of a native cape. It's not a Greco-Roman style. It might even be fringes or strips of leather or something like that that leave her belly uncovered here. And she's holding a distaff. So the spinner as a horned woman. And these horned women also turn up in Gaul, which is now France, antlered women who otherwise look very Roman with the cornucopia and the patera offering bowl and the dress that they're wearing, all very much carved in a Roman style, but they have antlers. And so I've been told there are more of these. As you can see, it's very hard to get good pictures of them. So the horned goddess, oh, here's one more. This is a bronze piece from central France. And so that was a thing. And this one also appears to be horned. I think I got this from Anne Ross, who is a wonderful source. Pagan Celtic Britain has a lot of pictures and drawings of this kind of art, pre-Christian art. And you have stories like the Irish one about the 12 horned witches, who are fairy women who pound on a woman's door, and the witch of one horn, of two horns, three horns, all the way up to 12 horns. And so this is somewhat of a demonizing story, because instead of being blessing goddesses who are welcomed with offerings, now the woman is trying to figure out how to get rid of them. You know, but the horned woman theme is something that exists in these parts of Northwest Europe. So what happens when the Romans come through is you see a huge increase in stone sculpture, very often in limestone, because this is what the Greeks and the Romans were doing, and making offering stelae, stones that were set up with pictures of the deity and sometimes inscriptions. In this case, we see the name Werbea, which we have actually the name for a goddess of a river, and the linguists have determined that the Wharfe River is actually a descendant name from this original goddess name. Not an uncommon pattern at all in Europe over many, many millennia, and that's a whole topic that I'll get into more when we do the Gaulish show. Many examples. But this is not very large. She's significant though, because you have the goddess, or perhaps her shamanic priestess, holding snakes in each hand, which is a very strong global theme that you can see in Nigeria and Iran and the ancient Canaanites, and even more recently in the Yucatan. That's very, very widespread. So in the Gaulish and the British world, we have these images of women dancing with snakes, or perhaps in this case a goddess, The course I just posted recently about this stela and the larger picture. This is just one panel out of 8 that are found on it. Torch in one hand and snakes in the other dancing. Here's another example, and this is not really a clearly sexed figure, but long-haired, holding snakes in both hands from Sernstad. And then we go into actual known examples of goddesses. And the reason we know who this is because it's written down here, to Brigantia. And so the inscription from the person saying, you know, who they are and their reverence for the goddess. And what we're seeing here is that these are both the same sculpture. So again, angle of view, very interesting to see the variation and lighting. With a globe in one hand and a spear in the other, and we can see very clearly that Brigantia has been imaged as Minerva. So she has you can see it more clearly on this side, she's wearing the aegis, just like Athena with the Gorgon's head. She has the helmet, the weaponry, the shield. This is all attributes of Athena, which have been plastered over Brigantia, who may have also had a warlike aspect to her. Here she's shown wearing the mural crown, which is an attribute of the Eastern Mediterranean goddesses, particularly Syrian Tuche. Cybele also wears it in Roman times, and so they're also syncretizing her with that deity. But there are a lot of these Latin invocation stones. This one says to the goddess Brigindo. This one here to the goddess Brigantia, and then, you know, made sacred in the name of the person, the vow of the person consecrating the stones. These are from different regions, also from Gaul. So we have these fierce women appearing, which may or may not have anything to do with Roman types. It doesn't really matter in a sense because the style is not Roman at all. It's very native Celtic. These kind of glaring eyes and, you know, the little spit curls here. You don't really see this stuff in Roman art. Here's another one who does show much more relationship with Minerva because of the heavy Greek style helmet that she's wearing, but that fierce scowling face. So that may be part of a pattern. And this one is interesting. I found this in Carlisle at the museum there, the Tully House Museum, where a lot of these images are that you're going to be looking at. And you see the image of the triumphal Roman conqueror trampling over the body of the native British warrior. And so they're saying here that, you know, this can be found in other places. And this was reused for a wall. So there's a lot of images that are discovered much later because they were repurposed for other construction projects. So here's a picture of, at least for England and Wales and Cornwall, where things were politically in the Roman invasion. And those yellow arrows are showing you the Roman lines of advance as they conquered their way up to the north. The Brigantes, named after the goddess Brigantia, are way up here. And so these are all different tribes. Here's the Silures, where we saw the little goddess from at Caerwent. And so that's kind of a picture of how it went. And it's not really showing on this map, but way, way up in the north off the screen is where they built Hadrian's Wall to keep the Picts out. But we're still not there yet in time. We instead are looking at the revolts of Celtic tribes. The Genii tribe of Norfolk in southeastern England. Boudicca is the queen of this tribe. This is the famous statue of her on Westminster Bridge in London, you know, as this very heroic form of her as a defender of native Britain against the Roman conquest. The war began because Boudicca's husband died and the Romans took away the lands that belonged to Boudicca. And when she protested, they raped her daughters and they flogged her and her daughters. And so this terrible humiliation was not to be borne. And so what she did is she gathered together a revolt of many Celtic tribes to try and stave off the Roman invaders. So here this modern picture showing men dressed in blue, painted in blue, the woad paint that's referred to by Roman accounts. And so Boudicca paint made them pay for what they had done, and they burned Colchester and St. Albans, and they besieged London. I think they burned London also as well. And so this was rough stuff. This was open warfare. And Boudicca is the original Celtic form of the name, but Boudicca is a romanization of it. So you'll often see the name spelled like this. And so these are later visualizations. You can see them using plaids a lot of what she would have looked like, and the chariots and so forth. And it become more and more fraught and romantic art as time goes by. But, you know, bloodthirsty battle queen who massacred her way through Colchester. So it's like, you know, history is all about spin. There was another queen also in this time who negotiated with the Romans, and that was Cartimandua, whose name means sleek pony in Brittonic language. Not as heroic a figure as Boudicca, because she actually became a client ruler of the Romans. She handed over Caratacus, who was a rebel, to them. And for her pains, later on, she took a new lover, which was completely her right as a British queen. But the Romans sided with her ex and installed him as king. So there was no loyalty on their part in these matters. These are obviously very late visualizations of the Picts, both the blue woad paint and also the Picti is the Latin name for native Britons who were using body paint. And it's very interesting that they were, these early modern artists are showing them as warrior women, something that continued to be the case in Scotland for a very long time. Any questions at this point? I'm just charging along here. Little metal objects. This female figure, maybe a priestess, once had either a staff or a spear in one of her hands. The other one is raised, gesturing. Little metal goddess figure there. And so you see things like this where herbal incense burners were found in burials. A little glimpse of funerary ceremony. And then you begin to see a lot of sculptures done with influence from Roman style, especially the very fact of their being carved in relief like this. That was really a lot of borrowing. But here we've got a water goddess with a pot and water flowing out from the pot, a very common theme, which we also see at the Temple of Coventina in northeastern England. Again, native style, but you've got these archways and pillars very much in Roman style. So kind of a fusion, but again, the pots with waters pouring out of. She's depicted with her maidens holding vases. She's wringing out her hair. This is an old folkloric theme. In fact, you can already see it all the way over into Thailand, where in the Khmer country, where the Earth Mother is shown wringing her hair in order to cause it to rain. Anyhow, all of these sculptures exist. They survived Christian attacks in the 4th century when the Roman Empire Christianized. You have priests and missionaries going around and smashing the icons of the goddesses and the gods, more so the goddesses. And so what happened is the devotees of Coventina apparently made an effort to protect these reliefs by putting them in the well. And that is how they survived the next 2,000 years. Only later then to be discovered by archaeologists. There's a lot of little fragmentary pieces like this one. Again, the water goddess rising up out of the waves, holding garlands in her hands. Here's Coventina herself, and actually this is how we know her name. To the goddess Coventina, this offering showing her with the waters flowing underneath her and greenery held in one hand. And so these spring goddesses are a big deal, not just in Britain, but also in Gaul. There are a lot of healing shrines that were built around hot springs, thermal waters. This one seems to be rising up out of the crest of 2 waves, or maybe those are supposed to be water birds. Those are maybe her legs. So kind of a Sheila-like posture again here, a proto-Sheila perhaps. And a lot of Roman style carvings also from what is currently called Bath. The Romans referred to it as aquae sulis. Sul is a Celtic name for the sun, also means eye in Irish. And so these hot springs had a solar goddess protector. You've got this sculpture again with the upended chalice pouring out the waters. And the Romans built a big temple there. And so you see the equation of Sul with Minerva. Just to say, her name is not Sulis. This is a genitive female ending in Latin. So it means of Sul, waters of Sul. Okay, so here's a gilt Sul Minerva. So what happens is you've got the Romans equating native goddesses with their own deities. And you see imports like this, looks like maybe an ivory piece, possibly even traded from Egypt. Not stylistically congruent, especially when we look at this necklace here. This one very much more in a Roman style, but a little bit of a native flavor to her. And this very definitely also at Bath, you have completely indigenous style here. These three almost skull-looking heads of the three mothers. And so I'm going to use that as our intro into a sequence on the Matres stones. And these are found all over Britain, France, bits and pieces in Spain and Italy under that name, Latin name, the mothers. And so they will have inscriptions to the mothers, and sometimes it will say a tribal name on there, you know, to the mothers of the Galicians, to the mothers of the Catavelunae. So they're either tribal names or family names, regional names. But you see them, these with the head struck off, we're going to be seeing a lot that met with this kind of repressive violence of the victorious Christian state. But holding baskets of fruit, sometimes loaves in their laps, sometimes chalices. So this is pretty par for the course. The heads are clearly, everything else is perfectly preserved, but they had to be killed. The heads struck off. And a lot of these are found up along the borderlands. And so Roman troops were stationed at these borders between what is now England and Scotland, essentially, against the Picts, to keep the Picts from overrunning the Roman settlements. And so a lot of these offering stones are offered by Roman legionaries. Let's just go back to that one for a second. And so you'll have references to the Celtic Boi, who were from Hungary, what was then called Pannonia. And so these aren't all just Britons anymore. And we're going to have occasion to look again at the presence of people of many different other nationalities and even continents in Britain. So this is over on the in the western side of England, near the Welsh border, Matres with loaves and fruits in their laps. And Cirencester has quite a few of these types of threefold mother goddesses. Here's another one with that typical Roman archway over them. Fruits, and swaddled baby. So we're now beginning to start getting hints of the threefold mother goddess, the threefold fate goddess, the ancestral godmothers, fairy women, basically, that we know of from much later folklore. Here they are, the threefold form already appearing, sometimes in conjunction with children and the idea of fating being given to children at birth. Other times holding Roman cornucopiae and the patera offering vessel. So there's varying degrees of influence on these sculptures. This one is fourfold instead of threefold. You'll see a couple from Gaul that only have pairs of matres. This, I think, might be the one from Blackfriars in London. Anyhow, they're also found up in the far north. And so here again, the heads are all ceremonially struck off by the supersessionist Christian order. These are all from Tully House in Carlisle. And the style of the boots, these leather boots, and the cloaks, they may have had hooded heads, are something very, very native, not at all congruent with Roman dress. So here's a very broken one that originally probably had 3 of these Dei Matres. And you'll find them occasionally also in bronze or other metal plates. Here's an example from London. Or singular mother goddesses with the child at the breast. You can see how broken most of these are. Head struck off. So there's this very clear thing that happens in the 4th century and maybe even later. We don't know the dates that this happened at, where there is an attack on anything goddess, anything pagan, anything that was not clearly linked to Christianity. And so in both of these examples, heads are gone. Interesting here to see she's holding kind of a scepter perhaps in her hand. It's not really clear what it is. And also she wears a crescent necklace, which you will also see on contemporary pieces from Gaul and especially from Germany. Some of the Matrone figures, as they're known in Germany, wear that. And so we have unknown goddesses with raven and pig. And then there's another pattern that's very interesting. And again, we have the threefold, but this time not applied to the goddess herself, but to her children. These are sometimes inscribed with the Roman words Genii Cucullati, the hooded spirits. And so you've got these cloaked figures with hoods. Here's your little Roman seashell canopy. But a seated woman and her children is what this looks like, or a seated goddess and her children. There's this, sometimes you see armed figures. So these seem pretty likely to be male to me in most of the art. And this one's interesting because on the back we have an inscription that gives us the name of the goddess, who's called Kuda. And this again from Cirencester, one of those things. So these beings are dressed in a style that would have been native British dress with the hoods. It's cold up there, right? But also there is some suggestion of maybe shorter statured people. Here they are shown as little beings, child-sized beings, in the company of the goddess Rosmerta, the great provider, again holding, I'm not really clear that that is a scepter because she's got this bucket next to her. We'll come to that. But she's shown with Mercury, who does have a scepter. So native goddess and Roman god. And this pattern of Rosmerta and Mercury also appears quite a lot in Gaul. So you can see how many of these there are, you know, how little we've been exposed to it. Some of these look very childlike. The capes are very short. They're not wearing anything else, but they do have the hood. And they resonate a lot. We're going to see this also when we come to the Pictish stones in Scotland, with Irish stories of the Dagda, the good god, who is a druidical figure, kind of a buffoonish trickster figure, but he also is described as wearing a cochal, which is directly related to this word for hood in Latin, which is very short. In fact, in the stories, it is humorously and obscenely short, so that it barely cuts the crest of his butt in behind. So, you know, everything shows, in other words, with this garment that the Dagda is described wearing nothing but. Anyhow, lots of these hooded spirits. The proportions are very childlike on this one. So elves or children, there's been a lot of debate about that. And here's a threefold group of them at housesteads. This is in the far north on the border territory. It's common to have the hooded spirit beings in threes in Britain and singly in Gaul. Here's an example where they're really looking a lot like spirits, just almost like the brownie archetype, pixies, various names given to the helping spirits in the household in much, much later folklore in England, Wales, Scotland. So there are quite a few of them. And sometimes the mother goddesses themselves are wearing the hoods and wearing the shorter skirts, so that what I said before about those figures being male, maybe, maybe not. You know, they're not wearing full-length dresses. You can see their moccasins. Same thing with fruits in the lap. So there's all kinds of mixtures, and you see Mercury, Rosmerta here in the center, and then the Roman goddess Fortuna combined with each other. Here again, we have Rosmerta and Fortuna. Mercury is off to the side here. This is from Somerset. So there's actually quite a lot of representations of this native goddess. And Rosmerta, Ro means great, and Smerta means she who provides. Same Ro is also in Ro Danu, that becomes the Great Danu, the great river that becomes the name for the Rhone River in France. But another thing with Rosmerta is that what I was looking at before and saying, is it a scepter? Here appears to be a dasher, which is a staff that's used in churning. She's got a churn and a dasher in her hand. And this is even more unambiguously shown because though her head is struck off, she's shown working the dasher in the churn. And so she's a goddess of the dairy. The great provider gives food. And so she's shown in this sort of energetic pattern here, churning the milk to make butter and cream. Once again, this looks like another scene of that. This one from Bath. And another. So that's pretty unambiguous. It's kind of surprising if you didn't know about some of the long-held stereotypes and failures to see on the part of certain archaeologists. You would never know that this was a marked theme. The mysteries of the dairy, women's work in making cheese and butter and all of those things that we know of in Ireland very clearly, because Bridget is associated with the dairy in that same way, and the never-ending supply of milk or of butter, of cheese that are associated with her stories. But anyway, the native British goddesses begin to take on attributes of the Romans. So you'll see the cornucopia showing up in some of the sculptures. Here she's shown with a Celtic god, Tutates, which means he of the tribes. It's French, Gaulish piece. Here again with Mercury, and Rosmerta holds the cornucopia. So sometimes she's with the Roman goddess and the cornucopia in the hands of Fortuna, and sometimes she herself takes over these attributes. And that's what we're seeing here, is this very native rendering of the goddess of fortune and of plenty with the Roman cornucopia in her hand, but the whole style of her is very much indigenous. And yet she's got the patera from which she's pouring out offerings onto a small pillar altar, which is straight out of the Greco-Roman world. So these interesting fusions take place. And these are two views of an altar that's now in Carlisle. With the offering pillar on top of it, she's placing the Wheel of Fortune. You know, the game shows are named about ancient goddesses going back a very long way in time. And so there's more than one of these. And we saw the pig in an earlier picture. This is something that we know from Welsh lore. The pig was a sacred animal. And so seeing her in combination with a goddess is not unexpected. This one's kind of interesting because the inscription in Latin is to the mother fates. Parcae being the name for the fates in Latin. And so the inscriptions are telling us a little bit about what's going on here. It's almost as if the presence of Latin votive inscriptions precipitates to us names of Celtic deities or other beliefs that were not visible to us without this practice of carving limestone altars and dedicating them to deities that was borrowed from the Romans. And certainly the Latin script itself gives us a lot more to know about what their beliefs were and who their deities were than we would otherwise have. Here's another single mother goddess with the basket of fruits on her lap, seated on kind of a throne. And so there's a lot of these. This is an interesting sculpture because stylistically it's kind of a fusion of Roman and tribal styles, whether that be Celtic or Germanic. And these are interesting because they show a Mediterranean influence. These types of ceramic terracotta, really, ceremonial stands are known from the Mediterranean region. We see them with the Greeks, the Etruscans, you see them in Spain, in the Phoenician sphere, and here they are turning up all the way near the border of Scotland. This is classic Germanic style. There's the little crescent pendant that you see on a lot of these, the linen bonnet, as they call it. Some people see these as afros, but it seems pretty clear cut that these were actually cloth headdresses worn by Germanic women. She's got the basket of fruit there in her lap, and this is a mold-made, mass-produced item that was traded out of the continent along with scads of Minervas and mother goddesses and Venus figures from the Roman, much more Romanized region of Gaul. But you see the Roman goddesses appearing like this pillar altar showing Diana, the huntress, and her dog. Here she is again in a much more primeval native style from the far north. And there are a few also bronzes showing priestesses. Antistitae means she who stands before the altar in Latin. And so you see the same gestures, that older figure that I showed you from, what was it called, Wood Eaton, one hand gesturing, the other hand reaching out or holding an object. The veiling and all of this is very much Roman in style. And here she's shown with a bucket, perhaps also a churn symbolism that we saw earlier. And we also have this male figure, otherwise showing goddess attributes with the cornucopia, the patera, and the way the serpent is coiled around the wrist is reminiscent of the Roman goddess of the women's mysteries, Bona Dea, the good goddess. So that serpent symbolism is something we see here from Gloucestershire in Britain and also from Mavilly, where we earlier saw the snake dancing woman. Something very Kundalini-like about this idea of the snake coiled around the pillar. And a lot of the other art is really very much influenced by the Roman world. Everything about it, the style, maybe even also this staff with the standard symbols on it, pouring an offering onto a burning altar there. So you do find actual Roman goddesses in bronze, the grain goddess. Some other pieces that are interesting are these three-way offering vessels. This is small, not large, used in votive offerings. And so they're proposing here that it was a way of offering to the threefold mother goddesses of the Matres. And so this is still in northwestern England. You've got a bronze parade helmet of a type that is very Mediterranean in the way the hair is shown, and the Phrygian cap, which comes ultimately out of the steppe world. The Scythians and even the Amazons are shown with that hat. And so this is back again to this idea of the fact that people from the far-flung corners of the Roman Empire wound up in Britain. And so here is somebody writing in Greek a dedication to Astarte, and this is at Corbridge, pretty far north. We see a freedwoman of British name who was a slave to a Syrian from Palmyra and who eventually marries him. And so Regina Cucullati, and it's her name written there. And so there's all kinds of cultural mixing going on here. And in fact, there's evidence, quite a bit of it, that the Sarmatian warriors were part of the Roman legions in this time period. And there's evidence for them archaeologically. And so you see sphinxes of Greek type and This one looks like a woman. It's probably a male figure, just based on what I've observed about them. Little bits and pieces of the last native styles in ceramic, and you can still see traces of that latin swirling patterns that we were looking at in the mirrors before. And so I want to come back to those mirrors, which this is an example, because the mirror also appears in a Roman era villa mosaic on the floor. This is up in Yorkshire. And so we have a goddess with the mirror and perhaps a fruit or flower, but in the company of a selkie, part human, part seal. Around the sides are some of the emblems associated with the zodiac in Greco-Roman astrology, so that we've got Taurus, we've got Leo as a lion, but then when we get to Scorpio, it's a deer. And then I'm assuming that this horned panther creature is Aquarius. There are various figures like Hercules from Roman mythology, but this woman with the mirror seems to be indigenous and much more associated with this, I think, magical mirror is what we have to really look at, that these mirrors were not simply, certainly they would have had the use of being used to look at yourself and comb your hair, but they also had other meanings, including scrying, divinatory meanings, ceremonial usages. Anyhow, this labyrinth from Tintagel is mythically associated with Arthurian site. Some people say that the labyrinth is actually much later than that period. And we find various kinds of containers like this one. These are called thread boxes in some of the literature that I talk about in Witches and Pagans. Women would not only keep needles and thread in these containers, but also herbs, the teeth of various animals, various magically charged objects, so that this is kind of getting into the women's mysteries from another side. You find bronze offering spoons like these, and this one's interestingly inscribed with the directional symbol. And I'm not really going to go into the Welsh literature because it's out of our time span, but I just want to signal the existence and the continuation of the language and of folkloric themes, just as you see in Ireland with the many epics that were in poems that were written down by monks in either the original language or sometimes in Latin. And so the Black Book of Hergest, and apparently this passage says, "I dreamed a dream." So you see the older elements of culture that were preserved through this literature as it was recorded. Some of the Mabinogion and some of the other texts are quite patriarchal. You see themes of punishment of powerful figures, particularly Rhiannon, she of the magical bird song. I don't really have pictures to talk about her with, but I do more so with Morgan Le Fay. And so we're going to look now at the Arthurian epics. And this is very late. This is one of the Romantic painters 100 some years ago. The word Morgan Le Fay is the form that Mallory preserved in the 15th century, but Morgana, there's a lot of different forms of this name, who was basically a fairy goddess, but one associated with magic and sacred knowledge. She knows all the languages, she knows all the herbs and healing powers. She gradually gets made into a villain in the retellings of the Arthurian cycle. The Welsh dragon, symbol of the country. All of that is for another show. Looking at I talk about that a lot in the Fairy Faith show, which will eventually become available as a stream on demand. But anyway, back to the stones, because as I was saying, these stones remain on the landscape. And so eventually this witch's stone, as it was known to the Scots, it appears, it's now destroyed. The Presbyterian kirk got to it. But for many, many centuries and maybe thousands of years, women used to slide down the witch's stone in order to get the power to conceive. And so direct contact of their vulva with the stone, they're absorbing the essence of the stone. And so now I want to look at a more recent pattern of standing stones and stone carvings. This is much later than the megalithic era because the Pictish stones are at their earliest 4th century and going on maybe at a very, very generous estimate into about 900. It closes off more before that. But you have a group of symbols here that recur throughout these stones. The serpent makes a lot of appearance. We have the broken arrow theme. We have the comb and the mirror symbolism. And so this is what I was referring to before. This idea of the mirror as a female symbol is something that is in the archaeology even before this period of Scottish history in the early Middle Ages when they were beginning to make these stones. The serpent again here, crescent and the broken arrow. Actually, there's 2 broken arrows on this one. And then you have Ogham script, which is an old Celtic script, well, I guess it is an alphabetic script, but not one that looks like one to most people. So this is Celtic times, this is Celtic culture. The Picts were Celtic-speaking people. And so one of the theories is that these stones were boundary markers of territory of differing clans and tribes. And so that the animal, the snake in this case, might represent a clan spirit. There's a lot of them, but it's interesting because if they were boundary markers, and I consider that a very likely possibility, then the broken arrow may have a significance there too, which is one apparently of peaceful relations. You break the arrow to show you're not fighting. You're not going to target those other people. But these are some of the examples shown here of the serpent. Turns up a lot, and this looks also like one of the mirrors, the knotted patterns that we're going to see a lot of them. So anyway, if these are boundary stones, there is a very clear-cut pattern of, in this case, eagle with salmon in its claws. We have the wolf, the bull, the duck or goose, the salmon again there in combination with that, the serpent and the salmon, and there's our old Bronze Age style, Iron Age style mirror, the pig. This is showing us where those Pictish stones are from. You can see the bulk of them are from eastern Scotland, but then by sea it looks like people came around down this way to the islands, and they're found. This is Orkney Island, which would be up here in the top. And this also gives us an idea of the configuration of peoples at that time. So the Angles and first the Saxons, then the Angles take over, and this becomes England, right? There's still some Britons that got pushed up into this area of Cumbria, that borderland region. And Gaels, the Scots, came across and settled part of Scotland from Ireland. This is where the name Scotland comes from. And then the Picts pushed further north than everybody else because they're like the remnants, perhaps of an older Celtic population than some of the others. And so there's a lot of controversy about who the Picts were, whether their language was even Celtic to begin with. That's been pretty well settled. There's this Pictish king list, and it was observed that kings were not necessarily followed by their sons, which would indicate a matrilineal succession pattern. That has been disputed. It can still be a matrilineal pattern of inheritance if kings are followed by their brothers rather than their sons. You know, it's just not, it turns out to be a lot murkier because when I began studying all this, it's like, oh yes, the Picts are matrilineal. Maybe not. There's not a lot to go on. I mean, this is not the oldest, the list I think dates to like the 900s or something like that. Anyway, be that as it may, there is this very strong female symbolism in the Pictish stones, in addition to the idea of the peacemaking apparent meaning of the broken arrow, which recurs over and over. I mean, this crescent and arrow symbol are among the most common on these stones. Sometimes it's combined, a doubly broken arrow is combined with a dual, what do I call this? You could call it the eye symbol, you could call it the double disc symbol. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this. And then you have these strange beings that have been compared to dolphins, especially the way the nose on them is dolphin-like. And so they are referred to as the Pictish animal, just as a way of saying, well, okay, you know, this is a known pattern. This is a thing. And it turns up a lot here again in combination. I mean, these could be eyes. They could be the sun and moon. They could be breasts. It's not really clear what this signified to people. And you also see it showing up here in these beautiful pieces of silver jewelry that come at the end of the great fluorescence of Pictish culture between, let's say, 400 and 800. So this is the very last gasps of it. Same themes. You've got the Celtic script there, dragons and other beings, very expertly crafted in gold and silver. A lot of similarities here to Irish art. And so these were hoards that were found long after this historical period, which is how they survived. Anyway, that elaboration really tracks with some of the later Pictish stones. You see extremely rich patterning. You do see crosses beginning to make their appearance. And so what happened in Ireland also happens here. You have a mixture of indigenous elements along with this new symbolism of the cross coming in here. It's not yet the cross of execution. It's much more an Aboriginal view of the cross as the quadrants of the directions. The Cadboll stone, and I've blown up the figure of the woman riding on the horse here. She's seated side saddle. She's not straddling the horse. Very much in congruence with older representations of Epona, the mare goddess of the Celts, whose stelae are spread all over Europe. But she sits enthroned on the horse rather than riding it. But notice in this close-up, you don't see it, but over here, the mirror and the comb. So very much connected with the female figure here. Mirror and comb. So some of these are rough and others are extremely elaborate and fine. Mirror and comb with the broken arrows. The double eye or whatever it is, combined with the double broken arrow. Mirror and comb. Salmon. This, I'm not really sure. It kind of looks like a tuning fork. It may be a split sword, in which it would be another form of the broken arrow, the idea of a non-violence at the boundaries. There again, very finely Iron Age type of mirror and comb. Mirror and comb. Mirror and comb. Magle is very rich. There's a lot of these stones. These numbers refer to the way they numbered the stones. And so you have riders, you have monsters, chimeric beings, you have the serpent again, the Pictish animal, the mirror. So this is called the maiden stone. And there again, that female theming being represented here with the mirror and comb in combination with the dolphin-like animal. More riders, more eyes. Crescent and broken arrow. So eventually you start to see more and more Celtic crosses. And what they do is you've got this knotwork pattern that's so characteristic of both Scottish and Irish Christian manuscript art. The knotwork is probably older in this part of the world, but you can see that a basic quadrant now is extended to make the rood, the type of cross that you see in Christian churches. But then right next to it is we have this very Dagda-like character, a man wearing a cloak, the cochal of the Dagda in Ireland, who is not wearing much else. You know, so this is this mixture of themes. And so you see the crosses on one side, well actually both sides here, the cross makes its appearance, but in combination with all kinds of fantastic animals, seahorses and different things too, serpents, mirror and comb, and you've got all the other Aboriginal elements, including cup marking People are taking rock dust out of this stone for ceremonial purposes. So the pagan and the Christian side by side. And this one has some similarity to images of Freya, or at least that's who they think it is, who is tugging on her braids. So that could even have a Scandinavian influence. Interestingly, on this one, it was a cross, and someone went to the trouble to go and obliterate only the cross part. So maybe a little trace there of pagan resistance. Anyhow, these are all incredibly beautifully carved. A cockatrice there, some kind of lion or dog figure. And so this is the end. This is the end. I mean, they're not really, they're making a few Pictish stones at this time period, but hardly at all. This is now built into an abbey. So you've got the adoption of this old style. There's a transition that happens where it kind of morphs over into Christian churches. And of course, all through this time, Scotland arises as an independent nation, their own king, the Lia Fáil, the Stone of Destiny at Scone, where the kings of Scotland were crowned, and a very similar story to the Irish, that the stone had to cry out under the rightful king. So these are feudal societies, you know, even in the beginning of the Pictish stone period, you're going to see an aristocratic hierarchy going on here. And I would contend probably patrilineal. Sheila-na-gigs make their appearance, however. Iona, one of the famous monasteries, this was an all-male monastery where scriptures were being written and being raided also by the Vikings. And so then finally the Sheilas appear in later churches in various parts of Scotland. I don't know if this is supposed to be a pig or a possum or a hedgehog or what that is. And so there's a lot of these that aren't so well known. These sort of humorous, wrinkled, laughing Sheilas. Well, the very prominent vulvad Sheila-na-gig of Colchester. And the most well-known of all the Sheilas at Kilpeck in Herefordshire. Is this Hereford or Hereford? I forget. I guess it's Hereford. Holding open the portals of birth, the entryway into existence for all humans. And then finally, this last kind of humorous Sheila throwing up her legs and showing this very broad opening that I would guess people are scraping out their magical rock dust from, built right into the walls of the church. As this one clearly was. This is cut specifically in Eastern England so that the Sheila, notice the portal in her body right next to the portal in the doorway, and you have a male figure advancing toward her. They're built for the church. This one too, built into the church at Oaksea with a very large vulva sign and clitoris. And then later on, they tend to get pushed up out of view further up way near the ceiling at the tops of capitals. This is the cathedral, so the Archbishop himself is presiding over this space, but the common people are still carving Sheilas. Note the very crone-like face on this one. And so you'll still find this going on in churches later on, and even most amazingly in fonts. These are baptismal fonts showing Sheilas, undoubtedly because of the birth connection for the use of these fonts. And so these are also found, by the way, in Spain. Another way that people carried along their ancient beliefs through various changes of rulership and new religions coming in and the death of the priestesshood, at least in the formal form, but somehow surviving through the witch, through all those hard centuries of vehement patriarchy.
I want to add a couple things that I have acquired since this was recorded in 2019. And first, we're looking at an aerial view of the Merry Maidens. The Merry Maidens at Boscawen. This is, obviously a stone circle. You've got the sighting stone there. And then following that, also a detail of the 9 maidens stones at St. Columb. So just a little bit from that megalithic era. And then there's the Spinner's Rock in Devon. And this is a dolmen that was said to have been raised by 3 spinning women during a single night. And this theme of one night's work, you see it over and over again in the fairy faith. Elves, the little folk, are said to have created a whole megalithic monument during one single night. The spinning women as megalith builders or raisers or bearers shows up a lot on the continent, and especially in France, northern France, and then also bleeding over into Germany, where you have a fairy maiden who is walking along, spinning, or a crone, it could be a crone, spinning while balancing a tall megalith on her head. And so this is one more instance where the fairy beings are also the ancestral women and also the megalith builders. A little bit more from the Bronze Age, and so you start to see metal blades, but also beaten gold plates, ornaments with fine engravings on them. And this is something that is very current in southern England, especially. You have the Bronze Age gold plaques or pendants from Wiltshire and Shropshire near the border of Wales. And they have the same fine engravings on them, very same patterns as we see on the golden lunulae, which occur both in Britain and in Ireland. And then finally, we have some very fine silverwork jewelry from the Pictish era, where you see the repetition of some of the motifs that we've seen, some of the patterns as well, especially the broken arrow, which shows up on the Pictish stones, but also turns up in this pendant or whatever it is, and lots of animal heads, both the lion's head or wolf's head on the pendant, but also this other larger piece with animal head finials. And a lot of the patterns are very similar also to the ones that are engraved on the Pictish stones.